This is a continuation of our series of presentations on sea level rise and sea level rise resiliency. Kelsey Ducklow, an environmental scientist in our statewide planning unit, will kick off the presentation, and we have a special speaker here today who she will introduce.
Good morning. Thank you, Jack. As Jack said, I'm here to continue our series on sea level rise presentations. Specifically, I'll be presenting on some of the sea level rise vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning work going on throughout this region. And as you'll see from the notes on this slide, I'll be covering more counties than we have in past presentations, since you all won't be back up this way for several months. And then I'm going to turn over the presentation to Dr. Robert Lempert to talk more specifically about some phased adaptation approaches. So diving right in, I want to start by setting the scene a little bit. Over the past couple months, you've heard about sea level rise vulnerabilities in some of the most heavily urbanized portions of Southern California. Conversely, the central and northern regions of the California coast are characterized by a more varied mix of urban and rural areas, including, for example, the open areas along the coast in Sonoma and throughout Big Sur, as shown here. These more rural areas host a variety of coastal resources, including bluffs and rocky intertidal habitats, low-lying beaches and estuaries, agricultural lands, and numerous public access and recreational areas, including, of course, the coastal trail. These rural areas give way to more heavily urbanized towns and cities like San Francisco, Santa Cruz, Monterey, Morro Bay, and Pismo Beach. Not surprisingly, this variety of coastal context brings with it a variety of sea level rise vulnerabilities. For example, in the more rural open areas, natural habitats will be the primary resources vulnerable to sea level rise. Depending on site-specific geology and geography, some natural habitats may be able to transition naturally as sea levels rise. Softer, unconsolidated bluffs will erode, and beaches and other habitats will move inland if undisturbed by development. For example, Marin County Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment found that marsh habitat on the east shore of Tomales Bay is fairly resilient to sea level rise. The figures on the right show expansion of upper marsh habitat inland, even as intertidal and subtidal habitat grows on the bayside. In other areas, however, Highway 1 and other infrastructure and land uses could prevent the natural migration of habitats. Shown here is Elkhorn Slough, which hosts a large complex of important wetland habitat. Within and adjacent to these areas, though, is a railroad which often floods during king tides, as shown on the bottom of this picture, along with agricultural lands, infrastructure, Highway 1, and Moss Landing Harbor. Pause. Yeah. So you can see Elkhorn Slough now and all of the agricultural lands and some of the development up near the inlet, as well as the railroad down in the bottom of the picture. The Nature Conservancy and the Coastal Conservancy recently completed a statewide sea level rise vulnerability assessment of natural habitats in California, and in order to ensure protection of wetlands in this Elkhorn Slough area, the report calls for ensuring resilient landscapes are conserved. These are areas shown in lime green on the map, and those are areas that are currently undeveloped but not formally conserved as open space, as well as investing in conservation and management of adjacent areas where wetlands could move into as sea levels rise. These are shown in the darker yellow color and represent uplands and lands with lower density uses. It's important to note, though, that as we saw in Humboldt Bay, many of these adjacent lands are currently agricultural lands. Thus, even where development isn't blocking the migration of wetlands, there are still trade-offs that need to be considered in adaptation planning. As expected, in addition to beach and habitat vulnerabilities, more urbanized areas show significantly more built assets that are at risk from sea level rise, including many areas that are already at risk during El Nino and storm events. Shown in red on the figure to the right is area in Pacifica that could be exposed to erosion with about 4.5 feet of sea level rise through 2100, assuming there are no armoring structures in place. The apartments along Esplanade Avenue that were removed in response to erosion are located to the north of this figure and shown here on the left slide. Several areas in Pacifica are also vulnerable to flooding and storm events. These include areas near Sharp Park and along Beach Boulevard, which is already armored and has experienced storm damage in the past. This kind of damage will be exacerbated as sea levels rise, and currently protected development will become even more vulnerable. The City of Monterey's vulnerability assessment showed similar types of vulnerabilities, including numerous residential and commercial structures at risk, particularly around Cannery Row and the wharf areas, as well as the low-lying areas around El Estero. These same areas also show considerable wastewater and sewer infrastructure vulnerabilities, as these utilities are needed to serve existing development. Lastly, there are also several important commercial and recreational harbors in this region, such as Pillar Point Harbor right outside the door, and the Morro Bay Harbor and Embarcadero area shown on this slide. The coastal-dependent nature of these assets will require different strategies, in particular those that can accommodate changes in water levels and ensure that access opportunities and utility infrastructure can be resilient over time. For example, the two pictures at the bottom of the slide show floating docks and utility lines under piers, which are in vulnerable areas but are necessary to serve coastal-dependent uses. This is just a quick overview of some of the vulnerabilities in this region, but there is much more information available. This includes information developed through the vulnerability assessment reports underway or completed through our now 6 rounds of LCP grants. Highlighted here are the 12 jurisdictions who have received grants from the Commission, all of which have completed or initiated vulnerability assessments in this area. Additional information can also be found in the statewide sea level rise vulnerability synthesis Commission staff completed in 2016, which is also available on our website. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to highlight that there is also a lot of adaptation planning and strategy implementation going on in this region. A prime example that I think you're all well aware of is the inland relocation of Highway 1 near Piedras Blancas. After years of damage to the highway and emergency placement of riprap, the Commission conditioned an armoring permit to require Caltrans to develop a long-term solution for this stretch of roadway. This requirement set up a phased approach wherein the highway was protected by armoring while an inland relocation strategy was identified, designed, and constructed. Today, the highway is set back further inland, allowing for beaches and habitat areas to erode naturally. In addition, the project resulted in an additional 3.5 miles of coastal trail, and land has been added to Hearst San Simeon State Park. This is an example of phased adaptation occurring through a set of coastal development permits, but a range of adaptation options are also being considered within LCP planning and integrated into LCP updates. Returning to the Morro Bay Harbor area, these figures show phased approaches the city is considering in their adaptation plan. These include shorter-term accommodation strategies, such as moving utility lines to the top of piers, adding check valves to storm drains to block the entrance of water, and ensuring that floating docks are designed to accommodate higher water levels. Longer-term options would include elevating all of the Embarcadero if worst-case scenarios of sea level rise come to pass. The San Francisco LCP, which was approved in 2018, also lays the foundation to implement phased approaches to address the erosion impacts to the mix of beach, public access, transportation, and wastewater infrastructure at South Ocean Beach. Similar to Highway 1 in Piedras Blancas, repeated damage to parking lots and roadways prompted a series of CDPs for armoring and made clear the need for a long-term solution. The Ocean Beach Master Plan, which has been partially implemented in the updated LCP, calls for eventually removing riprap, a parking lot, and a portion of the roadway, rerouting traffic inland, creating bike and pedestrian access ways, and restoring dunes. It also contemplates the potential need for a buried low-profile wall to protect wastewater infrastructure over the medium to longer term, or at least until alternative wastewater and stormwater strategies can be developed. These changes would eventually result in what we see at the bottom right of the slide. Lastly, on Wednesday, you approved an LCP grant to support the development of a coastal hazard response plan for a San Simeon wastewater treatment plant. The need for such a plan was also laid out in the special conditions of a CDP for temporary armoring, which you can see in this photo. And the grant project and hazards plan will primarily include identifying options for removing the plant from its current vulnerable location and either relocating it or developing alternative wastewater strategies. These kinds of phased approaches are called for in both the Commission's sea level rise policy guidance as well as the state sea level rise guidance from OPC, and will be critical for ensuring the coastal resources and development are resilient to sea level rise over time, and in such a way that best balances the often competing resource needs of these different types of resources. On that note, we have invited Dr. Robert Lempert to talk more about planning and implementing these kinds of phased adaptation approaches. Dr. Lempert is a principal researcher at the RAND Corporation and the director of the Pardee Center for Longer Range Global Policy and the Future Human Condition.
Thank you.
And he has a different PowerPoint up.
Okay, great. So I should have a PowerPoint up there. Thank you. Is that going to come up?
It's a different PowerPoint.
Okay. Here we go. Great, there we go. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. So I'm going to, as Kelsey said, talk about phased adaptation and some ideas that are proving popular and successful. So as Kelsey said, I work at the RAND Corporation and have also been involved with various assessments, the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC. So as you well know, sea level rise is a unprecedented challenge for coastal management. We know for certain that it's a major challenge, but how fast it will unfold, how serious the impacts will be, are more uncertain. Several guidance documents in recent years, both the OPC sea level rise guidance, this California climate safe infrastructure guidance, lay out this concept of adaptation pathways, which I want to talk to you about as a way of organizing phased adaptation. And the key language from the sea level rise guidance, the step 5 I have down there, develop adaptation pathways that increase resiliency to sea level rise and include contingency plans. So I'm going to just lay out how this aims to work. So the first thing is that the best available science generates a very wide range of scenarios. And so this is the OPC sea level rise for projections for Santa Monica, where RAND is. And it goes all the way from this is 2,100 for about a foot to 6 feet. And this is the probabilistic part where the guidance lays out probabilities, how likely it is to reach these different levels. And then there's this 12-foot H++ worst case scenario floating out there. And so the key thing is, first, it's a very wide range. And it doesn't include all the relevant uncertainties for any particular place, subsidence, storm surge, et cetera, and that these numbers are also virtually certain to change as with each guidance. The central numbers stay relatively constant. The worst case dances around a lot. So how do we systematically deal with this? So this idea of adaptation pathways is a structured approach to phased adaptation, and these pathways consist of, first, an initial action, infrastructure design, a land use decision, and then it explicitly has tipping points and signposts. So a tipping point is the level of sea level rise and other stressors up to which the initial decision meets its goals. So if it's a piece of infrastructure, of say a road, that's the level of sea level rise at which that road can safely operate, have traffic on it, and so forth. And then signposts, which are indicators that you're approaching that tipping point. And then a contingency action that would be taken if we get to the tipping point. So the adaptation pathway has all of those elements. Okay, so let me just take you through a notional example of how that works. And just this notional decision is, you've got an aging road, do you repair or relocate it? And so here I lay out tipping points. So for repair, let's say it's good up to 2 feet. If we relocate, it's good up to 12 feet of sea level rise. And then if we choose to repair it now, we might upgrade it later, and we'd be good up to 6 feet. And so just laying that out here. And so these are the different options, and these are the tipping points. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the numbers as they were in the OPC guidance, which basically asks the how much question. So you say, how much sea level rise are we likely to get in 2100? And just flip it around and ask the question, by when? So on this chart, I've got time at the bottom, and then various levels of sea level rise, and then these bars, which show, let's say you're interested in 3 feet. The dot on the far left is the earliest that you'd get there in the worst case. This is essentially the H++. Then the next dot is when am I, sort of the most plausible, the earliest plausible, which is 5% likelihood. And then the bar is basically, sort of the bulk of the likelihood. It's 33% or more. So this gives you a sense of, if you have a tipping point, when you might reach it, all the way from the worst case to where it's more likely. And once I've got that, I can lay out a chart like this, which says, if I repair, I'm good to 2 feet. That, in the worst case, would be good to 2045. Likely is good to towards the end of the century. And, sort of the earliest plausible would be about 2060. And then similarly for the others. And then what's often really nice about this approach is that you can lay it out in these essentially subway maps, where you say, if I start on the repair, it's good to 2 feet. And that the little dot means I'm not good after that. If I relocate, I'm good up to 12 feet. And then if I start with repair, I can follow these different lines. I could start with repair. If and when I get close to 2 feet, I could decide either to jump all the way down to relocate, or I could jump to upgrade. If I jump to upgrade, then I'm good for another 4 feet, and then I could jump down. So these are called subway maps because it's sort of like, I want to get to a destination. These are the different ways I can do it. These little circles are the tipping points. This is where, if you're on one line, you have to get off and get on another. And then we can lay out the timelines for the different scenarios. So the likely scenario, is the least stressing, and then down at the bottom is the worst case, which becomes most stressing. And then you can also put together monitoring programs and say, what is the best scientific evidence that I'm approaching a tipping point? What would I monitor, both locally or globally, to determine that I'm getting close to a tipping point? And then you can lay that out as part of the plan. And then once you've done all that, then the choice is, which line do I start in? And so in this notional example, relocating might be a good choice today if relocating today is not too hard and it's inexpensive, or if future upgrading would be really expensive, that not doing it now locks in some other situation that would be hard to fix later. Repair may be better if, in fact, you're not locking yourself in, if you, have the ability to fix it later. And so you can go through these. And it's clear then, actually, both the repair and the relocate options are not going to last forever, particularly if emissions don't follow going to zero by 2050, because then we'll eventually get more than the 12 feet of sea level rise. Okay, so I showed you a notional example. In a number of jurisdictions, people are starting to plan this way very specifically. This is the adaptation pathway for the Thames River barriers, those great big storm surge gates that protect London, and it's all laid out, not to go through this in any detail, but the 1 meter line, you see that there's lots of options for getting there. Then they've got a whole range of different paths you can take that gets you up to about 3 meters, and beyond that, really, they would just have to rebuild the whole thing. But this is just all laid out, and this is in the specific management plan for the river barrier. Okay, so one of the advantages of thinking, a number of advantages of thinking this way is that it avoids both under and over commitment. Particularly if you're building a big piece of infrastructure, what do you do with that 12-foot H++? I mean, do I build to it? That could be really expensive. And this gives you a way of avoiding that, but also not getting yourself into trouble by building something that then does not last for more to its design lifetime. It allows you to focus resources on the most important near-term decisions, but at the same time allows you to consider the full range of futures. And it can often be useful for generating consensus because you're dealing with both the likely and the worst cases within a single plan. So people are looking at both sides. You can get them together. I haven't laid this out, but you can choose among the pathways on both economic criteria, cost effectiveness, benefit cost, but you can also lay out a number of other criteria as well, and you can do these stoplight charts with that and use those to choose among the different options. And I've just shown you infrastructure examples, but this can be used a lot more broadly. And then just some implementation challenges. It's new, so you have to adopt new methods. You have to pay attention to the monitoring. I mean, it doesn't work if you have a plan and then you don't pay to have the monitoring done or to assimilate the information. It may require using conditional permits in different ways, not only on time, but maybe on the scientific evidence that says we're approaching a particular tipping point, which may happen in 10 years, maybe happen in 70 years. So it's a different type of conditionality. It may be important to have some sort of financial mechanism so that if you're doing the less expensive things now and then the more expensive things, if and when you hit the tipping point, that the money is available, either because someone is responsible, you put some money in escrow. Some of the jurisdictions that do this have various mechanisms. They try to set money aside. And then it may be useful to do pilot programs, in particular cases where this might be particularly important, to kind of see how it works and try it as opposed to going more broadly. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was
There's actually a whole group of people around the world, including the people who do the Thames River Barrier, the Dutch Adaptive Delta Program, and throughout California that do this sort of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, cool website.
Is this going to be available online? Because they didn't see it on our...
Yeah, I mean, yeah. You can
Is
definitely
it?
make that
Because it's
available.
not...
I don't know.
We can't open it on our...
Okay.
We can make that available
Yeah,
for you.
happy
Yeah, I
to-
think that would be great.
Yeah,
I mean,
happy to
it's
send it to
a
you,
nice
yeah.
resource
Yeah.
to have. It's very informative. Any questions for Commissioner Wilson?
Thanks. So I see from your analysis that you're looking at really kind of moving physical things around.
Yeah.
Is there sort of a halfway approach with regards to adapting the use based on some of these changes? And I'd give an example of we've had this discussion for the highway between these two towns where I live,
Yeah.
where the Caltrans says, well, it'll be closed for 2 hours every month in under these scenarios, and thus we have to spend all this money and build this thing, other than adapt to maybe we just don't use it for 2 hours every month and extend that out. And so I'm just kind of wondering if that, there seems to be sort of an absolutist
Yeah.
perspective about the use of whatever these infrastructures are. You either once you can't use them for 20 minutes, oh my God,
Yeah.
versus adapting to these changes in terms of
I think that would be that would be a very appropriate use of this idea that you would adjust the requirements on the infrastructure, the operational procedures of a road or whatever, in order to increase your flexibility. Yeah, no, that was entirely consistent.
And I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's really great to hear from the director of the Party Center.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Commissioner Rice?
Yes, thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
Really interesting, and a decision-making tool like that is really, it seems so simplistic, but it also makes sense. Except that, and I was wondering if you could go back to the slide that had the subway drop-offs.
This
That
one?
one?
Yeah.
Yep, yeah, that'll work.
Let me actually put it there with all the numbers, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess, and I may have missed this, you don't have completely abandoned there. And this goes to,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, no, and I
Because
could have.
because I'm thinking that there's going to be scenarios where it makes sense and it is feasible both physically and cost-wise to get to a scenario that gets you out to 2150, but the 12-foot scenario, it really doesn't make any sense, and that it's not even about necessarily relocating something, it's about recognizing that that's going to have to
Yeah,
disappear.
you could certainly do that. Frankly, sometimes in talking to decision makers, they get worried about going out to 2100 and don't want to look beyond that. So I didn't put anything too aggressive. But clearly, you could have abandoned, and I did set this up so that after 12 feet, there were none of the options on that list were good past 12 feet. So if you were concerned about what happens, after 2100 at the earliest here, you would need to add that.
It's about doing that assessment also about investment. If something is not going to be able to have an extent, it doesn't have an alternative at some point, do you make the investment sooner, or do you make the investment to make something last for 6 feet or
Yeah,
whatever?
yeah.
Knowing, anyway, it's,
Yeah, no, exactly. This is designed to give you, a template to ask those sorts of questions systematically.
so have you have people applied this decision-making metrics? Is it at work anywhere?
Oh, yeah. So the Thames River Barrier, the Dutch Adaptive Delta Plan, Miami-Dade is doing this in a couple of its areas.
For what? Because the Thames River thing is just at a scale I can't even wrap my brain around it.
Well, again, the Dutch have a whole national program for managing their flood infrastructure. Miami, actually I think it's the city of Miami, has done this explicitly for one of their flood control basins, so actually on a very small scale, it's one thing. I can send Kelsey a list of some applications.
That would be kind of interesting to
Okay.
actually go to. Thank you so much.
Sure.
If I may, I also want to note that some local jurisdictions are starting to do this kind of thing in their adaptation plans. If you'll remember back to the slide I had on Morro Bay, they had kind of a schematic set up. It's just not getting quite into the detail of looking at the individual stepwise pieces and starting to develop all of the information that would be needed to make some of the economic and resource decisions to go to that. But they are starting to get into this type of approach.
There was an article in the New York Times, I don't know if you read it recently, it was 2 weeks ago or something, and they were giving the analysis of sea level rise, historically as
Yeah.
well as in the future, and how certain ice melting
Yeah.
is much more drastic and immediate than we thought.
Yes, yeah.
how often does that kind of input get put into some kind of a schematic like this so that, if you're looking at 2 feet by
Yeah.
2045 because you were reading
Yeah.
one set of data, all of a sudden, 2045 doesn't sound so far away anymore under a different set of data.
Yeah, so great question, and this is designed exactly to deal with that sort of problem because the H++ scenario does dance around a lot. And in fact, the science on which the 2018 guidance is based, is already, shifting around, and it tends to go up and down. So the idea is that it's kind of, sorry, let me just go back to this one. So the tipping point information is high confidence and is independent of what we understand or don't about Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets. So, this you go to your engineers and they tell you, yeah, I'm sure this road will work up to 2 feet, but after that it doesn't. And so that's high confidence information. The information on the timing is more uncertain, and that's why we lay it out in scenarios. And it may be, in fact, that the worst case gets sooner, it may get later. But the plan is meant to be as independent as you can of that best science. And if they, if you get information that the worst case is in fact worse than we thought in 5 or 10 years, the subway map stays the same. It just maybe you need to do it earlier, or you don't get to the tipping point at all. And so that's part of the key idea here, is to separate the things we know well from the things that are going to change as the science changes.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? Any questions? Well, this is really fascinating.
Well, good. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Oh, excuse me. Ms. Taylor, are you still here? I am. I thought that was you. Did you want to speak to this or just listening? Okay. Just state your name, what you have.
Good afternoon again.
Time.
Is it, yeah, it is afternoon. Judy Taylor, and I'm a co-stay for 45 years. The main thing that I wanted to stay around today and to see the presentation and to talk to you all about is what this means to my community. And you can see a good bit of it right outside your door here. We lost the apartment buildings in Pacifica. The city of Pacifica 2 years ago took $900,000 out of their $30 million general fund to pay for the removal of that building. It was a significant hit financially. We've lost Ranger Cottages down here in Half Moon Bay, and this is even without, sea level rise really amping up. That has to do mostly with the way the sand has shifted since the breakwater was put in. Two winters ago, we had the piers for the early precursor of what the Ritz was going to be exposed. Where the hotel was eventually built is back. But 50 years from now, we probably will not have that building. And that building, that resource right now, is providing between 15 and 20% of the city of Half Moon Bay's annual revenues. At the same time we're going to be losing that building, our sewer plant is going to go. It is in the same area as a substantial number of homes. Going further south, and even more near and dear to my heart, it's taken 30 years to fix Pescadero Creek. It's taken more than 25 years to start dredging our harbor out here. As we move forward, number one, we need you folks to develop some triage protocols so that we don't take 30 years to fix our problems as we move forward. We don't have that luxury. Second is, particularly in this area, inside the harbor, from everything that I've seen, there are no proposals to manage retreat the harbor away. We will continue to have some sort of a harbor between San Francisco and Santa Cruz, and it will need breakwaters. And inside that harbor, the water is going to move differently than it would if it were independent and unimpeded. So as we move forward with these adaptations and these strategies, it's important to me, just from somebody who's down in the weeds, dealing with this pragmatically and dealing with this all day, every day, we need to know that inside the harbor is going to have different rules than outside the harbor. And to do the one-size-fits-all across the board is not in the interest, I believe, of what your mission statement is. Sarah Wan, when she was the chair, one of her visions was to have the Coastside Trail come and be a waterfront on top of, around the edge of the harbor here. We would need to put in some armament there because there has been substantial erosion that has happened since the breakwater was put in. But in terms of controlling those buildings and those properties that, by the way, were all built since 1977 and so would no longer have any rights to armament under your draft guidelines, that there would be, the coastal trail would come around the point and around the harbor at the water's edge. And if you look out, I mean, all you have to do is walk across the street, and you can look out and you could see how jagged it already is. And it seems to me that just from a practical perspective, we need to start addressing those things now. It would be an asset for visitor servers. It would put, for visitors, it would put people closer to the water. It's a project that needs to happen. So I would just encourage you, as you move forward, look specifically at what our individual communities are going to be dealing with, and if we can start doing some things now, let's do. And please don't get so rigid in what you do going forward that we don't have the flexibility that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Staff, we have anything else?
I would just wanted to say that we absolutely agree that individual places are going to involve some very tailored decisions, and some of the coastal dependent uses, like in harbors, specifically have different requirements and that sort of thing. So we definitely understand that. Pescadero is working with Caltrans to address some of these things along Highway 1 as a surfers beach, and I believe Princeton is also starting to work on some adaptation planning. So they're going to be looking at directly these kinds of things.